welcome to this very special conversation with Michiel Soeting, who's head and global chairman, really, energy and natural resources at KPMG. A lot has been happening, Michiel, as far as India's energy sector is concerned. At least there are voices there. You've been, of course, associated and known and seen the India story for a long period of time. Do you think the energy sector in India is changing and changing for good?
I think so. Actually, India is the talk of the town. It's the hot ticket in global energy. If you look at the increase in energy demand going forward, which is expected to reach 1/3 of current demand, 25% of that demand will be in India in the next 10 to 20 years. So actually India has a lot of focus, and if you combine that with the current deregulation measures, your targets for renewable energy, like the 100 gigawatt solar power by 2022, or the 40% renewables in the energy mix by 2030, actually that makes the energy world and myself actually quite excited about India.
It's not been an easy road for India as far as the energy sector is concerned. We've had the experience as far as the power sector, and there have been a lot of concerns. The government right now is battling, the cabinet has put forth a plan as to how to rescue the DISCOM. It had an issue in terms of the entire banking sector. Costs are involved. And therefore, a lot of lessons have been learned, and we continue to do so. And so therefore, in this road towards those achievements that you just highlighted, or those benchmarks that India has set, what are the key things that really India needs to be cautious about?
Well, let me first say that DISCOMs is not really an issue only related to India. We see it in other countries as well. Even Europe is not very well connected if you look at the pan-European region. So I think clearly one of the key elements of the government is not only to look at the power source like renewables or coal, but clearly also how you distribute it. And particularly for solar in the initial stage, the integration with a grid is very important. What we see, of course, going forward, like clearly it was already a big game changer that the solar PV reduced so much in price, or the economics became much better. But actually what I think would revolutionize the power industry in India is the storage. So we see a lot of advancements in storage, and actually in our publication issued today, we predict grid parity for rooftop solar and storage by 2022, which actually will turn the world upside down, because we see a move away from a traditional model, so away from the large generating plants, the national grids. And what does storage do? Actually, it allows to deconnect the generation and the consumption, and it allows a distributed energy, meaning that you can generate energy and use it on a micro level on location. I think that will really change the world, the energy world, and particularly will be a huge opportunity for India, because you have a quite important task ahead where at the moment almost 300 million people don't have access to electricity. So energy security is on top of the agenda. The Minister for Oil and Natural Resources basically said it this morning at our conference. It's about energy security, and I think the technological advancement will really allow India to leapfrog actually into the new age of energy.
In your comprehensive report of KPMG that has come as far as the solar power sector, solar energy sector is concerned, there is no denying that the government since day one, at least the new government that has come in, has been actively talking about pushing renewable energy, pushing areas such as solar. There is no denying that. We've recently seen bids coming at one of record lowest prices. But what are the lessons, again, if I may look into, because in the UMPP side as well, there were lowest bids, and then we did not really expect some unforeseen circumstances, and now we are in a situation that, you know, it's at a standstill. How can we avoid, because we are still stepping towards, you know, exploring the solar energy, and therefore what should India be careful about?
Some of the lessons learned, particularly in Europe, are that the government needs to think about how it structures the incentives. What we've seen in Spain, in Italy, currently in the UK, that governments cannot afford their incentive schemes when solar becomes more popular. And what investors don't like is a subsidy-dependent type of energy sources. So I think for India, it's very important to consider carefully what type of incentives a government wants to apply. I think it's very important to have a sustainable type of development. Like you said, you don't want to come to a gridlock at a certain moment. But I think what will be really helpful in the case of India is the declining cost. So actually I think solar will become quite quickly actually a technology which won't be dependent on subsidies. And I think what's the main focus then for India would be how to integrate it in the grid, in the intermediate periods, and how to stimulate storage capacity.
There are concerns, you know, even as we see, as I was pointing about the solar bids, that it's way too low. Do you agree with that sentiment, that perhaps these bids have been too low as far as what India has seen, and therefore there are concerns on that regard?
Well, to be honest, I don't know the ins and outs of the bidding, but I think overall what's very important that it is sustainable, that if you look at investments, that the regulations are predictable, that there's a stable environment. So for me, for a relatively outsider to the Indian market, but looking at where foreign investors would be keen to enter a market, it's all about the stability of a system. So I think that should be the main focus of the government, to create such an environment.
We just heard, you know, some comments coming in, of course, from, you know, right now the Prime Minister traveled to the United Kingdom. There's already been a big deal that has been struck as far as the solar energy pact is concerned. The Prime Minister in Turkey now is talking about the entire issue of climate change and how India is going to really be adopting, and therefore the solar energy and the renewable energy comes into a key focus as far as India is concerned. What India needs to do to be able to achieve the targets that it has set for its renewable energy, for its solar energy, and to attract investments, because that's really important for India to bring that consistency in the investments coming in?
Well, first of all, India already has made big steps by deregulating, by allowing direct foreign investments, and actually you've already seen the benefits. Today, $35 billion of US dollars have been committed in investment in the Indian solar industry, primarily from Japan, from Taiwan, the US. And I think if you look at, so the key question would be how to attract more foreign investors. I think what the factors which will play a role is your stability of the regulations, predictability, but also how investors will look at the stability of the currency, your tax regime. And what will help likely India is the relatively low interest rates. So we have all these institutional investors looking for investment opportunities. Annuity type of investments like in the power industry are clearly in vogue. So I think to actually offer relatively stable returns, and actually the return on equity, if you look at the whole life cycle of solar, is relatively high. The latest predictions I've seen, 19%. So I think it comes down to allowing particularly institutional investors into the country, providing them with a stable platform. And there's no denying that India has been quite in focus because of the growth in demand, the aggressive targets you've set, also the deregulation of the government.
How achievable are those targets?
Well, I'm quite optimistic. We predicted around this time 5 years ago that the solar was moving to grid parity. And a lot of people said, well, KPMG is crazy by predicting that. Now maybe we are opportunistic or optimistic by nature, but I think we haven't seen the full scale of the impact of technology yet in the power institute, in the power industry. And I think the combination of solar and the storage capacity will be set into motion a new revolution. Because actually what it will do for India is that it will reduce the peak need on your grid. So actually it adds a lot of value into your existing infrastructure. And it deals with weaknesses in your system, particularly the discoms, which I think will be very beneficial for India.
5.6% is about 2019, 2020 is the growth of the solar in the entire energy pattern. About 20% by 2022 is what KPMG estimates the solar growth is going to be in India.
And I think that's achievable. We've seen it elsewhere. We are helped by the economics. If we talk to business leaders, CEOs of large power generation companies, they're not really optimistic because they can see the disruption to the industry. If you look at Europe, like Germany is a good example, already have pushed renewables. We can see that slowly the energy generating companies turning into energy service companies. And I think for India, who's actually is not stuck with or is not in need to restructure their energy system, no, you need to expand it. I think there are no really any hurdles to reach those targets.
Let me get a sense as far as the power sector again, and we discussed it briefly earlier as well in terms of the lessons that we need to learn. But of course the government has moved forward in terms of correcting certain part of it, bringing the states on board to take that heavy debt that discoms are bearing, and of course to move forward in that direction. Do you think that will be enough for really bringing those investors who've really come forward earlier in India, looking at the demand of the power, and therefore had participated in this entire power sector story of India, to really come back? Because I still hear the investor concerns that yes, the government is moving in right direction, or yes, it's at least some movement happening in that, but it's too early to really see a turnaround, and it's going to be difficult, and it's a very complex issue, so it's not going to be a very easy road ahead.
Well, I think investor sentiment clearly is impacted by the past. And so clearly India is actually on a very long roadmap. And so there's a wait and see. And I think investors on the pricing side also will look for market incentives. So the level of deregulation, how does it link in with your distribution network? Are the discoms able to charge more market-related price? Because clearly
that will be a very critical factor, actually.
Yes, clearly, because why is the debt so high? Because they were not able to charge market prices. And I think with the reduction, the reduced commodity prices, actually there's more an environment to do that. If you look at the fuel subsidies who have been lowered, And as I mentioned, the investors don't like subsidy-dependent businesses to invest in. So I think that will be a key factor. Reducing subsidies, allowing more market mechanism in the pricing, and then potentially you first will need to build a track record that this time it's serious. But
it'll take time.
It takes time, but I think very important is the support the central government has from the states. So there's also the regulation on the state level is moving in the right direction, and I think the opportunities are such with. If you look at the growth and compared to the decline in Europe in demand, like the energy demand is expected to decline by 15% in Europe, meaning that any institutional investor who wants to invest in energy, in new technology, in renewables, will look elsewhere, and the first country on the list likely will be India because of the scale of the opportunities.
So that's an optimistic note that you're really talking about. And the point that you made as far as, ensuring the subsidy part is reduced as much as possible. Before I get into the oil and gas sector, this entire mindset change that has been brought forth in India, even with regard to, if you look at the LPG subsidies, telling people to give up their subsidies if you're not really in that category. Is that also a positive approach that investors would be looking India?
I think it is. It is positive news, and it's also interesting. India as a resource poor country, except for coal maybe, but is actually being able to reduce subsidies because of lower commodity prices. So actually it's basically has the opportunity. It's completely different from what we see with the resource-rich countries. Like if you look at the Middle East, they also are reducing their subsidies, but for a complete different reason, because they cannot afford them anymore because of the low income they receive from because of low commodity prices. So I think it's the right thing to do for India, and you do it, and I think the prolonged forecast of low oil prices will really be of benefit to India, and potentially also you have opportunities to hedge yourself better of any price rises in the future.
The oil and gas sector in India, of course, right now, at least the balance sheet is getting very good for India with the oil prices really going down. But in terms of the policy changes as we speak, and we just discussed before this interview, how the government is looking and just has announced certain policy measures and seeking in terms of whether the revenue sharing model and all those drafts, and seeking consultation from all stakeholders. What are the key things that you think would be very critical for the oil and gas sector in the country to really move forward and realize its potential that we're still waiting for?
If you look at the landscape in oil and gas, there is no lack, I think, of opportunities, but there is a lack of capital. So what we see today is countries competing with each other, and for India to attract investments in oil and gas, it's a very simple recipe. You need to be competitive compared to other countries, meaning you need to weight the government take, balance it with the level of inbound investment you like to attract.
So the gas pricing formula is not competitive, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it needs to be competitive. So it's all relative. And if we consider, for example, a country like Nigeria, which hasn't seen any major investments for the last 10 years or so because of it's considered not competitive, and secondly, there is uncertainty about the regulation. So I'd like to add that aspect as well. So predictability of regulation and competitiveness, but which is relative. So it all depends on where are your investment opportunities. But in a day and age where $200 billion of investments have been cut, and here in India alone, $500 million have been cut this year of projects. I think governments realize if they want to generate inbound investments in the industry, they need to up their game. And I think the deregulation and the measures announced this morning, with revenue sharing contracts, with the liberation of the gas prices, I think all are part of a drive for the Indian government to attract investments.
You know, as far as oil and gas sector is concerned in India, we've seen several key arbitration proceedings happening against the government in terms of, again, the gas pricing policy issue has come in. There are whole other issues that have come into the forefront. And therefore, how critical would therefore be consistency in these policies for the investors to really come in and for projects to really take off?
Well, very important, because if you look at the length of these projects, first of all, between the initial design, final investment decision, and the operating, you talk about time frames of 20 to 30 years. So clearly, investors have a very long horizon, which is to somewhat a discrepancy with maybe the horizon of governments. Who may look at the next election term out of necessity. So I think a good track record, but then also the stability of regulation, very important.
My last question to you is that in the last few weeks, there were concerns that, of course, the government has come and looking at different policies, but there were concerns due to some domestic factors as to whether the government will be able to push forth its reforms and, you know, be in that reform trajectory, given the political scenario here in India. But as far as an expert on the energy and the natural resources sector, if you were to see certain reforms in the sector that really need to come through, what would that be, which will give you, you know, some sort of reassurance that, okay, India is in a right track and is not getting impacted because of its domestic factors or political factors?
I think on the pricing side, if there are incentives that there won't be cut, or to make sure that pricing can be done basically in a free market, in an unregulated market, that will be one. And probably second would be the consistency in your tax regime. Clearly, the retroactive adjustment we've seen in the past did quite a lot of damage to India, so I think that type of reassurance is very important. Only two demands. Only two demands
in terms of reassurance of the government outside of the parliament, which it may have to battle. But thank you so much for joining us here at Bloomberg TV India and sharing your perspective.
Okay, it's a pleasure. Thank you.